He humiliated and destroyed me for months. See how I turned it around and became invincible. For a long time, I believed I had finally found the person who would bring balance to my life. I was in a relationship that seemed perfect at first glance. The conversations flowed, the gestures were affectionate, and I felt seen and valued like never before. It was as if someone had placed before me exactly what I said I wanted: attention, presence, and the promise of a future. At first, I let myself be carried away by this feeling of completeness. With each encounter, I returned home with a full heart and renewed hope that perhaps this time, things would be different. It was as if I had opened a new book, its pages still full of possibilities, and I was eager to write a love story like the ones we see in movies. But deep down, there was a part of me that was already beginning to notice cracks in this seemingly perfect scenario. Although I tried to stifle this inner voice, like someone afraid of ruining a good dream before its time. At first, it was just details. A suspicious look here, a sideways question there, comments that sounded half-joking but left a bitter taste. I tried to rationalize, telling myself it was just jealousy, that maybe it was just a passing insecurity. After all, everyone carries some trepidation when they decide to open their heart. I convinced myself it was just a phase, that it would get better later. That was the first trap, ignoring the signs that were already there. Signs that warned me that something wasn't as healthy as it seemed. With every small inconvenience, I swept it under the rug because, deep down, I wanted to believe more in the image I'd created of the relationship than in the reality that was beginning to emerge. That's how I carried on, pretending not to see it, smiling to cover up the discomfort, and trying somehow to keep that fairy tale going. I still remember one particular night when we were at a party. It was a simple celebration, but it held enormous significance for me because it was the first time I was introducing him to some close friends. I was excited, proud, wanting to show that I was happy and that I had found someone who made sense by my side. However, what could have been a memorable night turned into one of the first moments when the mask truly slipped. He simply left me aside, wandering around the party, having fun with others, as if I weren't even there. I looked around, trying to convince myself that everything was okay, but deep down I felt a pang of humiliation, as if I were being relegated to the background in front of people who weren't even part of my life. It hurt more than I wanted to admit, because for the first time, I realized that maybe I wasn't as much of a priority as I'd thought. After that night, the conflicts began to intensify. Jealousy stopped being small nudges and turned into arguments. With every message that arrived on my phone, I had to justify it. Every time I went out, it was like filing a report. I found myself trapped in a cycle of demands that sapped my energy and robbed me of peace. And to make matters worse, there was always a third person who loomed like a ghost in the midst of it all: my ex. Not because I still had unresolved issues with him, but because he was used as an excuse, as a justification for insecurities that weren't mine. I felt forced to talk about a past that no longer made sense to me, but which was constantly brought up, like a wound reopened every time I tried to move forward. I was getting tired, but I still persisted, because I believed that love was made of patience, persistence, and trying 1,000 times before giving up. It was at this point that I realized I was giving up too much of myself to maintain a relationship that was no longer good for me. I was constantly making excuses to justify behavior that, deep down, was disrespectful. I stifled my tears to avoid appearing weak, smiled in public to maintain a semblance of happiness, and when I was alone, I sank into a heavy silence, full of doubt. I knew something was wrong, but I still clung to the hope that everything could change. It was during this period that I began to listen more to my friend Patricia, someone who was never afraid to tell me the truth I didn't want to hear. She was the first to put into words what I already felt, but didn't have the courage to admit. I wasn't being respected. It was hard to hear, but it was also a first step in opening my eyes to the reality I was living. Patricia's words echoed within me for days. "He doesn't respect you," was what she said. At the time, I even tried to counter, justify, say it was just a phase, that I knew the other side of him, that loving, attentive side that made me believe everything was still worth it. But the truth is, every time I repeated it out loud, it sounded like a poorly told lie. I knew she was right, but admitting it meant accepting that I was living in a relationship that hurt me far more than it healed me. I felt torn between two versions of myself, the one that wanted to cling to the fantasy of a beautiful love, and the one that could no longer bear the weight of humiliation disguised as companionship. This is where I need to introduce myself. My name is Regina, and this phase happened a few years ago when I was in my early 20s, starting to build my professional life, full of plans and hopes. I worked in a challenging environment, but I loved what I did. I had loved ones around me, like my family and loyal friends, but it seemed like my love life was always stumbling. Before meeting Lucas, I had gone through a turbulent relationship with Fabio, my ex, which left some scars and insecurities. So, when Lucas appeared, with that sweet and charismatic demeanor, I clung to him as if he were a safe haven. I wanted to believe that things would finally be different, and so I closed my eyes to many things that should have made me reflect. Things started to get worse when Lucas's friend Clovis started showing up more. He was the typical guy who thought he was funny at other people's expense, full of inappropriate jokes, always making comments about my life or my past. I couldn't stand his presence, but Lucas insisted it was just a joke, that I was exaggerating. And once again, I kept quiet. But each time I swallowed that discomfort, it was like I was betraying myself. Nadia, a coworker, once commented enigmatically, "You always seem worried, as if you're carrying something heavy and not saying it." That hit me hard. She didn't even know about my personal life, but she sensed from afar the anguish I tried to hide. There were times when I truly considered giving up. I saw myself tired, drained, with my self-esteem in tatters. I looked in the mirror and no longer recognized the woman who used to believe in herself. It was as if I'd erased myself to fit into a small space, where my opinions were silent, where my needs were always relegated to the back burner. There was a night when I cried so hard alone in my room that I thought I wouldn't be able to get up the next day to face the daily grind. It was at that moment that I realized that if I continued like this, I would lose not only the relationship, but also myself. And that thought was frightening enough to wake me from a torpor I'd been dragging around for months. The turning point began slowly, almost like a trial of courage. First, I decided to cut off contact with Fabio. Not because I still wanted anything to do with him, but because I realized that keeping that door open was always used against me, as an excuse for control and jealousy. Then, I began to set small boundaries, testing Lucas's reaction. And, to my surprise, I realized that each time I said no, something inside me grew stronger. Still, it wasn't easy. The fear of loneliness, rejection, and the judgment of others weighed heavily. But for the first time in a long time, I was looking at myself with a little more compassion, trying to see that perhaps I deserved something better than begging for crumbs of respect. It was during this process that I began to understand that the real battle wasn't against Lucas, Clovis, or external circumstances. The fight was against myself, against my own beliefs that I needed to endure everything to be loved. I grew up believing that love was made of sacrifices, that hardships were proof that it was worth persisting. But at that moment, I realized I was confusing love with dependence, with fear of being alone. I began to question myself. Why did I accept less than I deserved? Why did I normalize situations that diminished me? These questions echoed within me like an alarm, and little by little, they pushed me out of the place where I had imprisoned myself. My conversations with Patricia were crucial. She had a harsh but genuine way of reminding me of my worth. I often felt irritated with her, thinking she was overreacting, that she didn't understand what I was feeling. But after reflecting calmly, I realized it was precisely her voice that kept me going when I was thinking about backing down. I remember one day she told me, "Regina, you don't have to beg to be treated as you deserve. That should be the minimum, not the maximum." These words stuck with me like a kind of mantra. Every time I felt tempted to give in, I would repeat to myself, the minimum, not the maximum. And that gave me the strength to carry on. Of course, Lucas's reaction wasn't positive. When I started setting boundaries, he found it strange. The arguments escalated, the silences lengthened. He tried to manipulate me with promises of change, with emotional speeches, but I could already see the pattern. I saw that the pretty words were just a way to keep me trapped. Before, I would have believed him, but now a new Regina was emerging within me, one who was tired of suffering in silence. I realized that, even if he wanted to change, the responsibility for transforming himself was his, not mine. And I was no longer willing to carry the burden of waiting for a change that never came. I won't lie. There were times when I almost gave up on my decision. Sometimes, the longing for the beginning, for that affection, that attention, came like a strong wave, and I found myself wondering if it wouldn't be easier to go back, accept the way things were, and live in the illusion of good moments among so many bad ones. But each time this thought arose, I remembered the pain of feeling humiliated, the feeling of emptiness when I had to fight for crumbs of affection. And in this contrast, I found my answer. No, it wasn't worth it. I wanted more. I deserved more. And most importantly, I needed to prove to myself that I was capable of living without depending on the validation of someone who didn't respect me. It was at this point that I began to rediscover myself. I signed up for courses I'd always wanted to take, returned to activities I'd neglected, and even grew closer to coworkers, like Nadia herself, who discreetly offered unexpected support. She wasn't one to give direct advice, but her comments made me reflect. Like when she said, "It's funny how we get used to burdens we shouldn't have to carry." That simple phrase resonated with me. I realized I was gradually freeing myself from a burden that wasn't mine. And with each step I took toward independence, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in a long time. Over time, I realized that my growth wasn't limited to simply setting boundaries or cutting off harmful contacts. I began investing in myself in ways I'd never imagined. I returned to writing, an old passion that had always helped me organize my thoughts and emotions. I began taking better care of my body, not for aesthetic reasons, but for health and well-being. Each small achievement was a reminder that I could still be happy without relying on external validation. It was a liberating feeling to realize that I was relearning to love my own company, to feel complete on my own before expecting any recognition from others. There were moments of relapse, of course. There were still arguments and attempts to reconnect with Lucas, gestures that seemed like regret, pleas for attention, persistent messages. But I was no longer vulnerable to the superficial charm of the beginning. I learned to listen to my intuition and observe patterns of behavior. Every contact he made that tried to manipulate me or blame me for past situations, I responded firmly or simply ignored. And with each conscious response, I felt my personal power grow. It was as if I had discovered an emotional muscle I had never trained before, and with each exercise, it became stronger. Furthermore, my relationships with my friends deepened. Patricia, in particular, became an essential ally, not only for reminding me of my worth, but also for helping me see my own patterns and limitations. We talked about everything, and every word of encouragement, every nudge when I faltered, was a reminder that I didn't have to face everything alone. I also learned to listen to other everyday cues, like the presence of colleagues at work or Nadia's seemingly trivial comments, which reinforced the idea that I deserved respect and consideration. Small voices that had previously gone unnoticed now became valuable wake-up calls. It was during this process that I began to notice profound internal changes. Before, I felt anxious, insecure, always trying to please and avoid conflict. Now, every decision, every imposed limit, every choice to prioritize my own peace strengthened me. I was learning that there's no shame in putting yourself first. I discovered a strength that didn't come from another human being, but from myself, from the knowledge that I could walk alone and still be whole. This realization was transformative, because it allowed me to look to the future with genuine hope, without fear, without rushing, and without needing validation. The pinnacle of my transformation came at an unexpected moment. At a social gathering, I found myself surrounded by people, some friends, others acquaintances, and I realized I no longer felt the emptiness or insecurity that had previously consumed me. I was calm, comfortable in my own skin, and I observed others without the need to seek approval or display false happiness. Lucas was there too, but I no longer felt the same emotional impact he had on me. For the first time, I realized that life could be enjoyed to its fullest, without depending on a partner to complete my happiness. And in that moment, I felt a peace that seemed endless, the certainty that I had taken a definitive step toward my emotional freedom. With this new perspective, I began to consciously rebuild